Marcus Thompson crouched behind the overturned delivery truck, his rifle trembling in his weathered hands as the groans of the undead echoed through the abandoned streets of downtown Atlanta. 3 months had passed since the outbreak began, and what started as isolated incidents in remote military facilities had rapidly consumed every major city across America. The former construction foreman wiped sweat from his brow, knowing that the makeshift barricade surrounding their community center wouldn't hold much longer against the growing horde pressing against it. Behind him, 23 survivors huddled in the building's main hall, including Rebecca Martinez, a former emergency room nurse whose medical skills had kept them all alive, and Tyler Johnson, a teenage computer prodigy who had somehow managed to maintain their communication systems despite the chaos. The sound of splintering would made Marcus's blood run cold as he realized the infected had broken through the eastern barricade, their decomposing fingers clawing desperately at anything in their path. Rebecca rushed to the windows, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail as she assessed their situation with the same clinical precision she had once used to save lives in trauma units. The infected moved differently now than they had in the early days. These weren't the slow, shambling creatures from horror movies, but something far more terrifying. The virus had evolved, creating faster, more aggressive variants that retained just enough motor function to climb, use simple tools, and coordinate basic pack hunting strategies. She counted at least 40 of them streaming through the breach, their milky eyes scanning for fresh prey while blackened veins pulsed visibly beneath their pale, mottled skin. The nurse grabbed her emergency medical kit and shouted for everyone to prepare for immediate evacuation, knowing that their carefully planned defensive positions were about to become a death trap. Tyler's fingers flew across his laptop keyboard as he attempted to contact other survivor groups through their ham radio network, desperately searching for any nearby safe zones that might offer temporary refuge. The 17-year-old had lost his entire family during the first week of the outbreak but had channeled his grief into becoming their group's intelligence coordinator, mapping infected movement patterns and identifying potential escape routes through the city's underground tunnel systems. His equipment suddenly crackled to life with an incoming transmission from a military outpost 60 miles north, but the message was fragmented and filled with static interference that made it nearly impossible to understand. Between the broken words he could make out references to something called Operation Phoenix and coordinates that seemed to point toward a research facility in the mountains, though he couldn't determine whether it represented salvation or another elaborate trap. Marcus made a split-second decision that would determine whether his people lived or died in the next few minutes. Rather than attempting to defend their current position against overwhelming odds, he ordered everyone to gather only essential supplies and prepare for a dangerous sprint through the infested streets toward the old subway entrance 3 blocks away. The construction worker had spent years building structures designed to withstand natural disasters, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the psychological challenge of leading desperate people through a landscape where every shadow might conceal a predator capable of turning them into monsters. He distributed their remaining ammunition among the 5 people who still had functioning weapons, including David Park, a former police officer whose tactical training had proven invaluable during their previous encounters with hostile survivor groups. Rebecca injected each group member with their last doses of broad-spectrum antibiotics, hoping to provide some protection against the secondary infections that seemed to accelerate the transformation process in anyone who suffered even minor bites or scratches. The medical supplies they had scavenged from abandoned hospitals were running dangerously low, and she knew that any serious injuries during their escape attempt would likely prove fatal without proper treatment facilities. She secured her surgical instruments in a waterproof bag, understanding that her ability to perform emergency procedures under primitive conditions might be the only thing standing between her companions and a horrific death. The nurse had seen too many good people succumb to blood loss or sepsis because they lacked access to basic medical equipment that had once been taken for granted. As the infected broke through their final defensive barrier, Marcus raised his hand to signal the beginning of their desperate evacuation attempt. The group would move in a tight formation with the strongest fighters on the perimeter and the most vulnerable survivors protected in the center, but everyone understood that their chances of reaching the subway tunnels alive were slim at best. Tyler stuffed his communication equipment into a backpack and prepared to abandon the community center that had been their home for the past 6 weeks, knowing that they might never again find such a defensible position. The teenager wondered if the mysterious military transmission represented genuine hope for rescue or simply another cruel disappointment in a world where false promises had already cost countless lives. The rusted subway entrance loomed before them like the mouth of some ancient beast as Marcus led his group down the debris-strewn staircase, their flashlight beams cutting through the oppressive darkness that had swallowed Atlanta's once bustling transportation system. The air grew thick and stagnant as they descended, carrying the metallic scent of standing water mixed with something far more sinister that made Rebecca's medical training scream warnings about infectious diseases thriving in such conditions. Tyler's equipment registered no infected movement in the immediate tunnels, but the teenager knew that their electromagnetic signatures often became unreliable in the underground environment where concrete and steel interfered with his scanning devices. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit had momentarily faded, though everyone understood that the infected possessed an unsettling ability to track human scent trails even through the complex maze of interconnected passages beneath the city. David Park took point position as they moved deeper into the tunnel system, his police training automatically assessing potential ambush points and escape routes while his tactical flashlight swept methodically across graffiti-covered walls that told the story of desperate people who had sought refuge in these depths. The former officer had learned to trust his instincts during his years on the force, and something about this particular section of tunnel felt wrong in a way that had nothing to do with the infected creatures hunting them from above. His suspicions proved justified when they rounded a corner and discovered fresh barricades constructed from shopping carts, concrete blocks, and sheets of corrugated metal that someone had obviously assembled within the past few days. The construction showed military precision that suggested professional training, but the aggressive positioning indicated these weren't necessarily friendly survivors seeking mutual cooperation against the common threat. Rebecca examined scratches and stains on the tunnel walls that her medical expertise identified as human blood, though the patterns suggested violence between survivors rather than infected attacks. The nurse had hoped they might encounter other groups willing to share resources and coordinate defensive strategies, but the evidence before them painted a darker picture of humanity's response to societal collapse. She whispered her concerns to Marcus, pointing out bullet holes in the concrete that indicated recent firefights and warning that they might be walking into territory controlled by survivors who viewed newcomers as competition for scarce supplies rather than potential allies. The medical professional had treated enough gunshot wounds during her emergency room career to recognize the difference between defensive actions and predatory behavior, and these tunnel modifications definitely fell into the latter category. Tyler's communication equipment suddenly detected electronic signals emanating from somewhere deeper in the tunnel system, suggesting the presence of sophisticated technology that seemed impossible given the infrastructure collapse following the outbreak. The 17-year-old adjusted his frequency scanners and discovered encrypted radio transmissions using military-grade equipment that shouldn't exist in civilian hands, unless these survivors had connections to government or military personnel who had gone rogue during the chaos. His laptop screen displayed signal strength indicators pointing toward a section of tunnel that appeared to branch off from the main subway line, possibly leading to maintenance areas or emergency bunkers that weren't marked on any public transportation maps. The teenager realized they might have stumbled upon something far more significant than a simple survivor encampment, though he couldn't determine whether this discovery represented opportunity or extreme danger. Marcus made the tactical decision to investigate the signal source despite the obvious risks, reasoning that their group desperately needed access to better equipment and supplies if they hoped to survive more than a few additional days in their current circumstances. The construction foreman had learned during his years building emergency shelters that sometimes the most dangerous choices offered the only realistic path toward long-term safety, though he understood that his leadership decisions were becoming increasingly difficult as their options continued to narrow. He signaled for the group to maintain absolute silence as they approached the branching tunnel, knowing that their flashlights would announce their presence to anyone monitoring the area but unable to navigate the treacherous debris field without some illumination source. The side tunnel led to a concealed entrance marked with biohazard symbols and government warnings that most of the group couldn't read in the dim lighting, but Rebecca's medical background allowed her to identify references to classified research projects and containment protocols that suggested they had discovered some kind of official emergency facility. The heavy steel door stood slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of artificial lighting and clean corridors that contrasted sharply with the decay and abandonment they had encountered everywhere else since leaving their community center sanctuary. Tyler's equipment registered multiple heat signatures moving within the facility, confirming the presence of other survivors but providing no information about their intentions or capabilities. Marcus gripped his rifle tighter as he realized they were about to make contact with people who possessed resources and knowledge that could either save them or destroy them, depending on choices that would be made in the next few crucial minutes. The sterile corridors of the underground facility stretched before them like something from a science fiction nightmare, with emergency lighting casting eerie red shadows across polished floors that reflected their cautious footsteps as Marcus led his group deeper into what appeared to be a sophisticated research complex hidden beneath Atlanta's infrastructure. Dr. Amanda Wright emerged from a laboratory doorway with her hands raised in a gesture of peace, her white coat stained with chemical residue and her exhausted face bearing the haunted expression of someone who had witnessed horrors beyond imagination during the past 3 months of isolation. The virologist had been working alone in this facility since the initial outbreak, surviving on emergency rations and drawing power from backup generators while desperately attempting to understand the biological mechanisms that had transformed ordinary humans into the ravenous creatures now overrunning the surface world. Her voice trembled with a mixture of relief and apprehension as she explained that she had been monitoring their approach through security cameras and hoping against hope that they might be immune survivors rather than another group of hostile scavengers seeking to steal her research. Rebecca immediately recognized the advanced medical equipment surrounding them, including electron microscopes, gene sequencing machines, and biocontainment units that represented millions of dollars worth of technology that had somehow remained functional despite the collapse of civilization above ground. The nurse's training allowed her to understand the significance of the research data displayed on multiple computer screens, showing viral protein structures and genetic modification sequences that painted a terrifying picture of deliberate biological warfare development rather than accidental contamination. Dr. Wright explained that the outbreak had originated from a classified military project designated Operation Prometheus, which had attempted to create enhanced soldiers by combining human DNA with modified rabies virus genetics, hoping to produce troops with increased aggression, pain tolerance, and healing capabilities. The experiment had gone catastrophically wrong when containment protocols failed at multiple research sites simultaneously, suggesting either gross negligence or deliberate sabotage by someone with high-level security clearance. Tyler's technical expertise proved invaluable as he helped Dr. Wright access corrupted data files that contained crucial information about the viral mutation patterns and infection progression rates that could potentially lead to treatment options or preventive measures. The 17-year-old discovered that the enhanced infected they had encountered weren't random evolutionary developments but rather predictable progressions built into the original viral design, meaning that the creatures would continue becoming more dangerous and intelligent as the infection spread through larger populations. His analysis of the facility's communication logs revealed that similar research installations across the country had maintained sporadic contact during the early stages of the outbreak, but most had gone silent within the first month as their personnel either evacuated or succumbed to the very organisms they had been studying. The teenager realized they might be looking at humanity's last functioning research facility with the capability to develop countermeasures against the biological weapon that was systematically destroying civilization. David Park's law enforcement background made him naturally suspicious of the official explanations surrounding the outbreak, and his questioning revealed that Dr. Wright had been deliberately excluded from the highest levels of Operation Prometheus despite her expertise in viral pathology and infectious disease control. The former police officer recognized the classic patterns of government cover-ups and compartmentalized information that suggested the outbreak might have been intentionally triggered by individuals or organizations with specific political or economic agendas. His investigation of the facility's security records uncovered evidence of unauthorized access during the critical hours before the containment failures, indicating that someone with intimate knowledge of the research had systematically sabotaged safety protocols at multiple locations to ensure maximum viral spread. The officer's trained instincts warned him that the perpetrators of this biological attack were likely still active and would view Dr. Wright's research as a direct threat to whatever objectives they hoped to achieve through the continued chaos. Marcus struggled with the overwhelming responsibility of deciding whether to trust Dr. Wright with information about Rebecca's apparent immunity to the infection, understanding that such knowledge could either accelerate the development of a cure or make his group targets for every desperate survivor faction still operating in the devastated landscape. The construction foreman had learned during his career that the most important decisions often required balancing immediate survival needs against long-term consequences that might not become apparent for weeks or months. Dr. Wright's research suggested that natural immunity was extremely rare but could provide the genetic foundation for developing vaccines or treatments that might save millions of lives, though the process would require extensive testing and resources that seemed impossible to obtain in their current circumstances. The virologist explained that her most promising research avenue involved creating hybrid antibodies that could potentially reverse the infection process in recently turned individuals, but she needed access to immune blood samples and sophisticated laboratory equipment that existed only in a handful of locations now controlled by unknown survivor groups or overrun by increasingly intelligent infected hordes. The facility's alarm system shattered the tense quiet with piercing wails that echoed through the sterile corridors as Tyler's monitoring equipment detected multiple hostile signals approaching from the surface, suggesting that their presence had somehow been discovered by the very survivor factions they had hoped to avoid during their desperate journey underground. David Park's reaction to the emergency alert seemed strangely measured compared to the panic displayed by the rest of the group, and Rebecca's medical training in reading human behavior made her notice subtle inconsistencies in the former police officer's body language that suggested he possessed knowledge about the approaching threat that he hadn't shared with his companions. Dr. Wright frantically began securing her most critical research data while explaining that the facility's location was supposed to be classified information known only to a handful of government personnel, making their discovery by outside forces either an extraordinary coincidence or evidence of a serious security breach within their own group. Marcus felt the familiar weight of command responsibility settle on his shoulders as he realized that someone among his trusted survivors had likely compromised their position, though he couldn't yet determine whether the betrayal had been intentional or the result of captured communications that enemy groups had intercepted. The first explosive charges detonated against the facility's reinforced entrance just as David Park drew his sidearm and aimed it directly at Dr. Wright's head, his calm demeanor suddenly replaced by the cold professionalism of someone executing a carefully planned operation rather than responding to an unexpected crisis. The former officer revealed that he had been working with the Crimson Coalition, a militant survivor faction that viewed the viral outbreak as an opportunity to establish a new social order based on strength and military discipline rather than the democratic cooperation that Marcus had been trying to build among refugee communities. David explained that his group believed Dr. Wright's research represented a threat to their emerging power structure, since a widely available cure would eliminate the chaos and desperation that allowed strong leaders to maintain control over weaker survivors seeking protection and resources. His orders were to either recruit the virologist for exclusive research benefiting coalition members or eliminate her entirely to prevent other factions from gaining access to potentially game-changing medical breakthroughs. Rebecca's mind raced as she processed the implications of David's betrayal while simultaneously calculating her options for protecting Dr. Wright and the crucial research that might represent humanity's only hope for reversing the biological catastrophe consuming civilization. The nurse had suspected something unusual about David's background when he demonstrated knowledge of military protocols that seemed beyond typical police training, but she had attributed his expertise to cross-training programs rather than active collaboration with extremist groups. Her medical bag contained sedatives that could potentially incapacitate the armed traitor, but the dosages would need to be precise and the delivery method would require getting dangerously close to someone who had already demonstrated his willingness to kill former allies for political objectives. She caught Tyler's attention with subtle hand signals developed during their previous escapes, hoping the teenager could create some kind of distraction using his technical equipment while she attempted to neutralize the immediate threat to their group's survival. Tyler's laptop screen displayed surveillance feeds showing heavily armed coalition forces using military-grade explosives to breach the facility's outer defenses, their tactical equipment and coordinated movements suggesting professional military training that far exceeded the capabilities of typical survivor groups scrounging for supplies in abandoned buildings. The 17-year-old realized that David's faction represented organized remnants of government or military personnel who had decided to use the outbreak as an opportunity for seizing power rather than restoring order, making them potentially more dangerous than the infected creatures that at least operated on predictable biological instincts. His communication systems detected encrypted radio traffic indicating that similar attacks were being coordinated against other research facilities and survivor communities across the region, suggesting that the coalition was implementing a comprehensive strategy for eliminating potential challenges to their authority. The teenager understood that exposing Rebecca's immunity to David would likely result in her kidnapping for use as a breeding resource or experimental subject rather than voluntary cooperation in developing treatments for the general population. Dr. Wright's voice remained steady despite the weapon pointed at her head as she explained that her research had progressed far enough to confirm that natural immunity like Rebecca's could indeed provide the foundation for developing both preventive vaccines and therapeutic treatments capable of reversing recent infections. The virologist had discovered that immune individuals possessed unique genetic markers that allowed their cellular defenses to neutralize the modified virus before it could establish permanent neurological damage, but the process of synthesizing artificial antibodies would require months of careful work using sophisticated equipment that existed in only a few remaining functional laboratories. She offered to share her preliminary findings with David's coalition in exchange for protection and continued research support, though her medical ethics prevented her from agreeing to develop biological weapons or treatments that would be restricted to specific groups rather than made available to all survivors regardless of their political affiliations or resource capabilities. The emergency evacuation through the facility's hidden maintenance tunnels left Marcus's group exhausted and desperate as they emerged 3 miles from the research complex, carrying only Dr. Wright's most essential data drives and a hastily compiled list of specialized equipment needed to continue her immunity research at an alternate location she had identified in the abandoned Georgia Tech campus. Rebecca had successfully sedated David Park during the chaos of the coalition attack, but the former police officer's betrayal had shattered the group's trust and forced them to abandon most of their supplies while escaping through flooded drainage systems that left everyone soaked, cold, and vulnerable to the infected hordes that seemed to grow more organized with each passing day. Tyler's communication equipment had suffered water damage during their underground flight, limiting their ability to coordinate with other survivor groups or monitor coalition movements, though his backup radio still functioned well enough to receive scattered transmissions from desperate people trapped throughout the metropolitan area. The teenagers' intercepted messages painted a grim picture of coordinated attacks against multiple survivor communities, suggesting that David's faction was implementing a systematic campaign to eliminate potential rivals while consolidating control over remaining resources and strategic locations. Dr. Wright's alternate laboratory facility required specific pieces of equipment that could only be salvaged from the university's Advanced Biomedical Research Building, a 5-story structure located in the heart of Atlanta's most densely infected district where hundreds of enhanced creatures had established what appeared to be territorial hunting grounds organized around a pack hierarchy that defied conventional understanding of viral behavior patterns. The virologist explained that her immunity research depended on access to a particular type of centrifuge capable of separating blood components at the molecular level, along with refrigeration units for preserving biological samples and computer servers containing genetic databases that had been compiled before the outbreak began. Marcus realized that retrieving these items would require his people to venture directly into areas they had been avoiding for weeks, knowing that the evolved infected possessed enhanced senses and problem-solving abilities that made traditional stealth tactics increasingly ineffective against their coordinated hunting strategies. The construction foreman made the difficult decision to leave their most vulnerable members hidden in an abandoned subway station while he led a 3-person team consisting of Rebecca, Tyler, and Dr. Wright on the dangerous supply mission, understanding that their group's long-term survival depended on completing the research even if it meant risking immediate casualties during the equipment recovery operation. Rebecca's medical knowledge would be essential for identifying the correct laboratory equipment, while Tyler's technical skills could help bypass electronic security systems that might still be functional in the university building, and Dr. Wright's scientific expertise would ensure they retrieved the most critical components for continuing her work. The nurse had insisted on joining the mission despite Marcus's concerns about exposing their most valuable team member to unnecessary danger, arguing that her immunity might provide some protection if they encountered infected creatures and that her medical training could prove crucial if anyone suffered injuries during the high-risk operation. Tyler's reconnaissance using his remaining surveillance equipment revealed that the infected had established distinct territorial zones throughout the university campus, with different creature variants displaying specialized behaviors that suggested a disturbing level of cognitive development and social organization that challenged every assumption about viral effects on human brain function. The teenager observed that some infected individuals appeared to be directing the movements of others through complex vocalizations and gestures, while certain groups had begun using simple tools and coordinating ambush tactics that required forward planning and communication abilities that should have been impossible given the neurological damage caused by the modified virus. His analysis indicated that the research building was located in territory controlled by what appeared to be alpha specimens that retained significant portions of their human intelligence while gaining enhanced physical capabilities, making them exponentially more dangerous than the mindless creatures the group had encountered during their earlier survival experiences. The supply run began at dawn when infected activity typically decreased, though Dr. Wright warned that the enhanced variants might have adapted their behavior patterns to take advantage of survivor assumptions about creature habits and vulnerabilities. Marcus led his team through abandoned streets littered with the debris of civilization's collapse, passing overturned vehicles and demolished storefronts that told the story of humanity's failed attempts to maintain order during the initial outbreak chaos, while constantly scanning for signs of both infected movement and coalition patrols that might be monitoring the area for other survivor groups attempting similar scavenging operations. Rebecca carried emergency medical supplies and sedatives that could potentially slow infected transformation in case anyone suffered bites or scratches, Though her research with Dr. Wright had revealed that the enhanced virus strains were becoming increasingly resistant to conventional treatments and that exposure to certain variants could overwhelm even strong immune systems through sheer viral load concentrations that exceeded natural resistance capabilities. The university research building's corridors echoed with an unsettling silence as Marcus's team successfully retrieved the essential laboratory equipment, but their escape plan shattered when a pack of alpha-infected cornered Rebecca in the building's stairwell and she suffered multiple deep bite wounds that should have triggered immediate viral transformation according to everything Dr. Wright understood about infection progression rates. The nurse's medical training kicked in as she applied emergency field dressings to her injuries while expecting to feel the familiar burning sensation that other survivors had described during their final moments of humanity, but the minutes passed without any symptoms of neural degradation or cellular breakdown that characterized the virus's devastating assault on human physiology. Tyler's heart pounded as he watched Rebecca examine her wounds with clinical detachment, realizing that her lack of transformation confirmed suspicions that had been growing throughout their journey about her unique biological resistance to the modified pathogen that had destroyed civilization. Dr. Wright's scientific mind raced with the implications as she observed Rebecca's injuries healing at an accelerated rate that seemed impossible without some form of genetic immunity that could revolutionize their understanding of how to combat the viral outbreak. Marcus faced an immediate tactical dilemma as he realized that Rebecca's immunity made her simultaneously their greatest asset for developing a cure and their most vulnerable target for every desperate faction still operating in the post-apocalyptic landscape, including the Crimson Coalition forces that were undoubtedly tracking their movements through the city using military-grade surveillance equipment. The construction foreman understood that news of a naturally immune survivor would spread rapidly through the underground communication networks that connected various survivor groups, transforming Rebecca from a valued team member into a prize that rival factions would kill to possess or control for their own research purposes. His leadership experience had taught him that protecting valuable resources often required making difficult decisions about operational security and information distribution, but he struggled with the moral implications of treating Rebecca like a strategic asset rather than a person deserving agency over her own fate and medical choices. Dr. Wright's preliminary analysis of Rebecca's blood samples revealed extraordinary antibody concentrations that not only neutralized the modified virus but actually appeared to reverse some of the cellular damage in infected tissue samples, suggesting that her immunity might extend beyond personal protection to active healing capabilities that could potentially cure recently infected individuals. The virologist explained that Rebecca's genetic markers indicated a rare combination of immune system variations that occurred in perhaps 1 in 10 million people, making her irreplaceable for developing synthetic treatments that could be mass-produced for distribution to survivor communities worldwide. However, the research process would require extensive blood donations and tissue samples that could weaken Rebecca's own immune responses while providing the foundation for creating artificial antibodies that might save countless lives if they could establish secure laboratory facilities and maintain research operations despite the constant threat of attacks from both infected hordes and hostile human factions. Tyler's communication equipment intercepted encrypted transmissions indicating that the Coalition had somehow learned about Rebecca's immunity and was mobilizing significant resources to capture her before other survivor groups could exploit her unique biological advantages for their own purposes. The 17-year-old discovered that David Park had apparently transmitted detailed information about their group's composition and capabilities before his sedation, providing his faction with intelligence that compromised every aspect of their operational security and survival strategies. His analysis of the radio traffic revealed that Coalition forces were coordinating with other militant groups to establish a comprehensive search network throughout the region, offering substantial rewards for information leading to the capture of immune individuals and threatening severe retaliation against communities that harbored such valuable resources without reporting their existence to appropriate authorities. Rebecca's medical ethics training conflicted with her survival instincts as she grappled with the knowledge that her immunity could either save humanity or condemn her to a life of captivity and exploitation by groups more interested in maintaining power than developing cures for the general population. The nurse understood that her genetic advantages came with responsibilities that extended far beyond her personal safety, but she also recognized that submitting to involuntary research programs would likely result in her death through excessive blood loss or experimental procedures that treated her as a laboratory specimen rather than a human being deserving dignity and respect. Her emergency room experience had exposed her to the worst aspects of human nature during crisis situations, and she knew that desperate people often abandon moral principles when faced with choices between immediate survival and abstract ethical considerations that seemed irrelevant during life-or-death emergencies. The team's return to their temporary shelter revealed that other survivors in their group had already begun treating Rebecca differently once they learned about her immunity, with some viewing her as their salvation while others worried that her presence would attract unwanted attention from dangerous factions seeking to exploit her unique capabilities. Marcus realized that maintaining group cohesion would require careful management of both information and expectations, since the discovery of Rebecca's immunity had fundamentally altered the dynamics of their survival community in ways that could either strengthen their collective resolve or tear them apart through jealousy, fear, and conflicting priorities about how to utilize their most valuable resource. The abandoned pharmaceutical laboratory at Emory University represented their last hope for developing a cure before the coalition forces could capture Rebecca. But reaching the facility required a desperate journey through territory now controlled by what Tyler's reconnaissance had identified as evolved infected specimens displaying unprecedented levels of tactical coordination and strategic thinking that challenged every assumption about the virus's effects on cognitive function. Dr. Wright clutched her research data while explaining that the laboratory contained specialized equipment capable of synthesizing Rebecca's unique antibodies into a treatment that could potentially reverse infections in their early stages, though the process would require at least 48 hours of uninterrupted work in sterile conditions that seemed impossible to maintain given their current circumstances. Marcus coordinated with 3 other survivor groups through Tyler's restored communication network, arranging a coordinated assault that would draw coalition attention away from their route while providing defensive support for the laboratory once they reached their destination. The construction foreman had learned that effective leadership sometimes required risking everything on a single desperate gamble, and he understood that failure to reach the laboratory would condemn not only Rebecca to capture and exploitation but potentially doom humanity's chances of developing a widely distributed cure for the viral outbreak. Rebecca's decision to volunteer additional blood samples despite her weakened condition demonstrated the kind of selfless courage that had driven her throughout her medical career, though Dr. Wright warned that excessive donations could compromise her immune system's ability to protect itself against the increasingly aggressive viral strains they had encountered during their urban reconnaissance missions. The nurse had calculated that producing enough synthetic antibodies to treat even a small group of recently infected individuals would require substantial amounts of her blood, potentially leaving her vulnerable to secondary infections or other medical complications that could prove fatal without access to proper supportive care. Her emergency room experience had taught her that medical miracles often came at significant personal cost, but she remained committed to the research despite understanding that her survival was no longer guaranteed even with her natural immunity serving as protection against the primary viral threat. Tyler's technical expertise proved crucial as he established encrypted communication links with survivor communities across the southeastern United States, discovering that similar immunity cases had been reported in isolated incidents but that most immune individuals had either been killed during the initial outbreak chaos or captured by military remnants seeking to weaponize their genetic advantages for factional warfare. The 17-year-old's analysis of population genetics data suggested that approximately 3,000 naturally immune people might still be alive across North America, though locating and protecting them would require coordination between survivor groups that had been systematically destroyed by coalition forces implementing their strategy of eliminating potential challenges to their emerging authoritarian control structure. His communication network revealed that several research facilities remained operational in Canada and Europe, raising the possibility that international cooperation might provide resources and expertise beyond what their small group could accomplish working alone in the devastated American landscape. The coalition's hunting parties had begun using advanced tracking technology including thermal imaging drones and trained dogs capable of following scent trails even through the complex urban environment where most survivors had learned to hide their movements from both infected creatures and hostile human factions. Marcus received intelligence indicating that their enemies possessed detailed maps of underground tunnel systems and abandoned buildings that had previously provided safe passage for refugee groups, suggesting that coalition forces included former government personnel with access to classified infrastructure information that gave them significant tactical advantages over civilian survivors. The construction foreman realized that conventional evasion tactics would prove insufficient against such sophisticated pursuit capabilities, forcing him to develop increasingly desperate strategies that relied on unpredictable movement patterns and the kind of calculated risks that could either save his people or lead them directly into carefully prepared ambushes. Dr. Wright's research had progressed to the point where she could begin synthesizing test batches of artificial antibodies using Rebecca's blood samples, but the process required maintaining precise temperature and chemical conditions that seemed impossible to achieve in their current mobile laboratory setup while being pursued by multiple hostile forces through an urban environment controlled by intelligent infected creatures. The virologist explained that even minor contamination or temperature fluctuations could destroy hours of delicate work, and that producing a viable treatment would require the kind of sustained focus and environmental control that had become increasingly rare in their post-apocalyptic circumstances. Her scientific training demanded rigorous testing protocols that conflicted with the urgent timeline imposed by their tactical situation, forcing difficult choices between scientific accuracy and practical necessity that could determine whether their cure actually worked when administered to infected individuals. The team approached the Emory laboratory knowing that they were racing against time, coalition forces, evolved infected hordes, and the fundamental limitations of conducting advanced medical research under primitive conditions that challenged the boundaries of what was scientifically possible during humanity's darkest hour. The Emory University laboratory became the epicenter of a three-way battle that would determine humanity's future as coalition forces launched their final assault just as Dr. Wright completed the first viable batch of synthetic antibodies, while coordinated groups of alpha-infected seemed to understand that the research facility contained something that threatened their species' continued dominance over the devastated landscape. Marcus coordinated defensive positions with survivor groups that had converged from across the region, including former military personnel who had refused to join the coalition's authoritarian structure and civilian communities that recognized the cure represented their only hope for reclaiming civilization from both viral contamination and militant factions seeking to exploit the chaos for political power. Rebecca worked alongside Dr. Wright in the laboratory's sterile environment, providing continuous blood samples while the virologist frantically synthesized additional doses of the treatment that initial tests had proven capable of reversing infection in subjects who had been exposed to the virus within the previous 72 hours. Tyler's communication network enabled real-time coordination between defensive teams while providing early warning about coalition flanking maneuvers and infected movements that suggested the enhanced creatures had developed battlefield tactics specifically designed to overwhelm human defensive positions through coordinated assault patterns. The laboratory's security systems failed under sustained attack from multiple directions as coalition forces used military-grade explosives to breach reinforced barriers while infected hordes pressed against the facility's eastern perimeter with a level of tactical coordination that defied every previous understanding of viral effects on cognitive function and strategic planning capabilities. Dr. Wright made the crucial decision to begin administering the experimental cure to recently infected coalition prisoners and captured survivors rather than waiting for additional safety testing, understanding that proving the treatment's effectiveness during actual combat conditions would provide the credibility needed to convince skeptical survivor communities to accept widespread distribution. The first successful reversals of viral infection occurred within minutes of injection, with treated subjects regaining full cognitive function and retaining complete memories of their time as infected creatures, though they reported experiencing the period as a nightmare of uncontrollable hunger and aggression that they could observe but not influence through conscious decision-making processes. Marcus faced the defining moment of his leadership when coalition commanders offered to negotiate a ceasefire in exchange for exclusive access to the cure, arguing that their military organization represented the most efficient method for distributing the treatment and maintaining order during the reconstruction process that would follow successful viral elimination. The construction foreman recognized that accepting such terms would essentially surrender humanity's future to authoritarian control while ensuring that the cure remained a tool for maintaining power rather than healing communities, but he also understood that continued fighting might result in the laboratory's destruction and the loss of their only opportunity to mass-produce the life-saving treatment. His decision to reject the coalition's proposal and instead broadcast the cure's formula through Tyler's communication network to every surviving research facility worldwide represented a fundamental choice between concentrated power and distributed hope that would define the kind of civilization that emerged from the post-apocalyptic chaos. Rebecca's final act of courage involved volunteering for a dangerous procedure that would allow Dr. Wright to extract stem cells from her bone marrow, providing the biological foundation for developing a permanent vaccine that could prevent future viral outbreaks while ensuring that her unique genetic immunity could be replicated in laboratory conditions without requiring continuous blood donations from naturally resistant individuals. The nurse understood that the procedure carried significant risks including potential death from complications, but her medical ethics demanded that she maximize her contribution to humanity's recovery even if it meant sacrificing her own survival for the greater good. Tyler simultaneously transmitted the complete research data to international scientific communities while coordinating the final defensive push that would determine whether the laboratory could continue operating long enough to produce sufficient cure doses for immediate distribution to the most critically affected survivor communities. The battle's conclusion arrived when treated former infected individuals chose to join the defensive effort rather than flee to safety, demonstrating that the cure not only reversed viral effects but restored the fundamental human capacity for cooperation and self-sacrifice that distinguished civilization from mere survival. Coalition forces found themselves fighting against people they had written off as irreversibly lost while facing the reality that their power structure depended on maintaining the very chaos and desperation that the cure would eliminate through widespread distribution. Dr. Wright's successful synthesis of both therapeutic and preventive treatments ensured that humanity possessed the tools necessary for biological recovery, though the social and political reconstruction would require the same kind of cooperation and shared sacrifice that had enabled the cure's development during humanity's darkest period. The story concluded with the understanding that defeating the viral outbreak represented only the first step in rebuilding civilization, but that the collaborative spirit demonstrated during the crisis provided hope that humanity could create something better than what had been destroyed, learning from the mistakes that had made the biological catastrophe possible while ensuring that future generations would inherit a world capable of preventing similar disasters through international cooperation and ethical scientific research. Chat Control Sonnet 4.